welcome to the Kiefer's Hot Rod Shop YouTube channel. I'm Nick Kiefer. In this episode, we're going to check out the build of this tubular back half. Alright, let's build a back half. Got my main frame rails all drawn up. And got plenty of space to put them, so I'm going to kind of make an assembly to make sure everything's square. When I put it into the car, it's going to mount up to the number 15 bar there at either of those points where those upright number 18s go, and it's going to have a cross member that'll tie right into that cross member there that I'll put in later. So it's going to have plenty of other stuff triangulating it and bracing it, but that's the main gist of it. But for now, I'm bending a couple curved tubes with some cross members and a crossbar for the back that I already cut and cleaned up. And the parachute tethers and rear bumper mounting locations and all that will go to that tube, and that'll go across the rear at the back of the rear frame rails. So I'm about to cut them and bend them and then set them up and start making that sub assembly. Got the tube all set up for the rear frame rail. Got it zeroed out. It's time to give it a bend. And I'm gonna bend the other one and compare them, and obviously try to hit my target angle 31.5 degrees, but more importantly, I want them to be the same. Getting the rear frame rails notched and just checking to make sure they're congruent, and getting ready to make the notches at the other end here. I got these two cross members made up in addition to the rear cross bar there. So next I'll be able to set it all up and tack it up and get it started once I make those notches at the tail end here. Alright, getting ready to notch the rear of this second frame rail. Got this one notched up on both sides, and gonna cut that one and then dress the end and make sure they're congruent, and then everything should be ready to tack together. Alright, sweet. Got them cut and cleaned up and matched up. So they are a perfect pair. And next, clean the ends all up, clean the insides of the tubes up, and wipe everything down and square it up, stick it together. Got the main part of the back half tacked up here. Went over to Cut Snake Composites boats to use this nice welding table. Set everything up nice and square. This is still floating, so I can position it where I need later. But ready to fit up in the Nova. All right, back from Cut Snake Composites boats. Getting ready to size this guy up for the Nova here. I need to support the rear of this and in the front, line it up. Those notches fit onto that number 15 main hoop crossbar there. I'm gonna notch these number 18 little uprights here to fit around it. Everything is kind of coplanar just to keep it strong and all tied together. but it lays on the floor nice and flat, and it looks great. So one almost mistake I made was I did not drill the gas expansion holes for welding this tube in, and I've not drilled this either, but I'm not sure exactly where I'm going to put that. I left it loose so I can still kind of move it fore and aft. So I went ahead and I just drilled them from the outside through both sides of the tubing on both sides, and when I complete the weld and everything's good and sealed up, it won't blow that last bead out. While I had this on the table, I was able to get some nice beads with a couple of dabs each, and some of these joints I put 4 more tacks on just to take advantage of the fact that it was being held nice and flat and square on that table. So hopefully, since I burned it in pretty good, you can see I just kind of went for a couple little 2 bead stitches on that, hoping that it'll hold nice and true through the process of welding onto this, welding it into the car and moving around into position and everything. All right, got the rear frame rails mocked up in the Nova. Just working on kind of making sure everything is square and level and all that. All right, so we're going to check out how I made these gussets here that are going to support the rear bumper area of the tail panel that goes under the tail lights across the back of the car here. And I made a pair of them, and they're bent so that this part is level, just to fit with how I want to do the floor in the car. The outside of it is going to be level. It's kind of going to make a triangle, and then another triangle will go up on the tub up to the frame rail here. So I've got a slideshow that I'm going to play, just showing you some of the processes that took place to make these. So I started by bending, this is 1.5" 065 wall tubing. It's a little smaller than the 1 5/8 083 wall tubing that I use for the main parts of the frame, but it's a little lighter, and it's what I like to use for a lot of the gussets and stuff. So there's a couple kind of tricky bend operations in the tubing. The reason I did the tube as I did was for when I went to notch it, it just kind of made the notches a little simpler and easier to line up with the rear frame rails and the rear cross member that goes across the rear of the chassis. And now we'll check out how I used the welding table over at Cut Snake Composite Boats to get these lined up and tacked into the chassis. Back over at Cut Snake Composite Boats, welded up the gussets for the rear bumper area on the back half. So I still had it loose where I could pull it out of the car. This slides into the main hoop on either side. And measured the angle on these and shimmed them up and got them right where they need to go. I needed to preload this tube just from welding it to the main frame rails here. It had warped just a little bit, so I've got these guys pushing it straight with these guys holding it straight. And pretty straight. So that's nice, got it all tacked up. And time to stick it back in the car. All right, got the back half back over at my shop, and I was just working on welding where the little tubes are going to tee into this. These two joints that go down to those joints on the main frame rail. I wanted to close them up before they're covered up by the tube. And I welded these up a little bit just to make sure I seal them up before they're kind of hard to get to. This is the bottom of the back half, so this stuff I'm leaving tacked. I want to get everything in place before I start putting too much heat into it. Get everything reinforced with the upper rear frame rails and stuff like that. So it's gonna let it cool down, and then make sure this tube is cleaned up. It's actually a number 15 main hoop crossbar, but make sure that's cleaned up inside and out. And on the tips there where it welds to the main hoop, got a couple hose clamps situated to catch it height wise, and I'm gonna go ahead, and when I put it in there, I'll give it a couple tacks and then get ready to work on kind of the upper part of the back half. I'm gonna do a hoop in here, obviously my down bars, then some upper rear frame rails and stuff like that. The kind of the top of the back half ties into the main hoop, and eventually the door bars and A-pillar bars and all that via this rear hoop. And so we're going to take a look at how I bent and notched that, starting off with our first bend, and then obviously second bend, and it just has those two bends. And then I'm going to show you how I notched it and fit it up in the car. All right, I made the first bend and just measured everything out to make sure the angle's right and that all the dimensions I'm getting right, and we're looking good. So I'm gonna stick the other side in the bender, and I like to bend kind of from the center on stuff like this so that it's more symmetrical, because the bend looks a little different at the end than the beginning. So it's just nice to go kind of out from the center. All right, got it all bent up, 72 degrees on both sides. And now it's time to set it up for some notches so I can get it fit up to the main hoop. Got it set up to notch. This angle is 11 degrees and this angle is 10. And that is to account for the main hoop lean back, as well as the angle that the lower parts of that hoop, where that hoop's gonna go onto, where that meets up. All right, one notch down and one to go. I'm gonna cut this thing and we'll see how it fits. All right, I've got the rear hoop mocked up after notching it, and fits pretty well. It actually kind of clicks in because the notch goes far enough inside. I'm going to tweak the tubes a little bit to bring them together. It's actually, I've got it tucked in there, but it's sprung out just a little wide, which is good. This package tray isn't really even. You can kind of see it's sagged right there, but looking at everything else, I've got it pretty much set up level in here and looks pretty good. I've got the rear hoop fit up and notched up nicely. It's looking good. Been working on making sure everything's nice and level. Got the notches looking sweet, and pretty much cleaned up and ready to tack on. Well, I've got the package tray out of the way, and now it's time to add some more tubes to the back half. All right, I'm making some headway on the back half here. I've added this tube to triangulate the structure, and I'm working on making these uprights here, which will be accompanied by some tubes that'll support where the shocks mount, and then some rear upper frame rails that'll go all the way back to this area. But I need to make the other tube that goes from this cross member up to that number 1 cross member there, and what it's doing is reinforcing the rear frame rails of the back half from being able to kind of tilt up and down just from where it's welded up to that number 15 cross tube there. I've got both triangulators in to support the rear structure in the car and make it rigid with the front part of the cage. And I've been working on these connectors here, and pretty cool complicated notch here, lots of angles and stuff. So here's like a super crazy thing that I've figured out. This is 1 5/8 tubing, and you know, you can see this tube lands right on this curve here, and what I was able to do is to calculate the angle, I went ahead and just called that perfectly flat. So this angle that the tube is going down at, basically the opposite of that, I just notched it flat, but I used a 2-inch hole saw, which just fit around the outside of this curve like perfectly. It's the craziest thing, and it just works great. Well, I'm back in here getting ready to tack these tubes in, and I've just got everything pulled apart, and I'm going to clean the insides of all the tubes, and I'm drilling all of my gas expansion holes and everything right now while I can still get to everything. So it's going to be nice to have done, and wipe everything down with acetone and start tacking this stuff together, and then move on to X braces and stuff like that. So still got everything pulled out, and one thing I need to do before I start sticking more tubes in here is I need to go ahead and weld up some of these joints that I won't be able to get to very easily once these tubes are in here. So what I'm going to do is weld in these corners, and I want to go in alternating directions around the tube, and alternate side to side, top to bottom, just to try to keep everything kind of pulled together with the weld equally and oppositely. So if you're not careful, you can kind of parallelogram stuff like this, where you know, you have things leaning, or you know, obviously you can always put too much heat into something welding it, and that can warp tubes any which way. But a weld tends to warp a tube around the weld, and it also kind of pulls things in the direction you're welding. So for instance, something like this, if I were to weld this way, it's going to want to kind of pull this piece up, and it's also going to bend this tube. So that's why I like to have opposites or joints across from the tube. In some areas, like the rear cross member here, it's just impossible to do. So that's one reason I do have these gussets, is to try to keep this as straight as possible. But everything's really methodical with this, and sometimes you just have to do what you have to do, and just weld what you can get to or what you need to weld. But as long as you think about it and keep everything kind of in sequence, you can avoid some of that leaning and warpage. Alright, so I'm in here welding up some of these joints that are going to be pretty hard to get to after I put the rest of the tubing in. So now's going to be a really good time to go ahead and seal those up. And then later, once everything's in place, I can go ahead and finish everything else. One reason I want to put everything in, tack it all in before I finish everything, is just to use all these triangulated members to keep the chassis square. So sometimes when you just have some fairly unsupported tubes and you weld them, they can tilt and warp and stuff like that. So I want to keep this to a minimum, but I want to go ahead and take care of things that are hard to get to later, just so I'm not trying to reach the tungsten way in there and having to contort even worse than I am right now. So I've been welding these diagonals in a good little bit before I weld the cross member to the frame rails, just so that as I put heat into these and this cross member warps a little bit from the weld, and as everything kind of moves around as I weld, which I've also been welding the bottom some here. Not getting too crazy because I don't want to warp anything before it's all triangulated up, but I wanted to go ahead and do that before I welded this on, just so that I'm not pulling these frame rails around before I get these welded on there. So just kind of avoiding some internal stress and some warpage and misshaping by doing that. But I've pretty much welded it as much as I realistically can, welded those as much as I realistically can at this point. And so I'm getting ready to go ahead and start welding this cross member in. I'm going to need to go ahead and complete the beads on top so that these uprights can fit in here, and so they need to, they block that weld, so that weld needs to be completed under them, so that's just not left unwelded. But that's what I'm going to work on next. I'm letting these cool a little bit, once again, just to avoid as much warpage and internal stress as I can, and then I'm going to go ahead and start welding this on, and then tack these guys in. I've already got all my vent holes drilled and stuff like that, even in this hoop here. Might be kind of hard to see, but everything's cleaned out. I'll give it a final wipe down with acetone, and also in the process, my cross measurement from the main hoop to these corners has skewed almost 1/8 of an inch, so I'm gonna use this ratchet strap to pull it back square, so it's a little bit this way, not much, but just, you know, that little 1/8 inch. And I'm gonna go ahead and load it up when I tack that in, since that's a major attachment, these reinforcements to the main rails there, and that should square it up just fine. Once again, not real far off, but I just want to kind of take care of that as much as I can while I can. So we'll zap this up and check it out. All right, got that pass over the top of the cross member, and ready to position these uprights. I'm gonna probably have to take a little bit off of those points for that weld fillet. I'll just do that with a die grinder, but I'll make sure everything's cleaned up, and I'll let it cool down a bit, and then probably go ahead and tack those in place. All right, I got the 2 uprights tacked in. I measured back and forth a bit to make sure they're nice and even, and everything's dimensionally where I need it, and it's looking pretty good. I'm gonna have to run beads over the back for the shock area gussets. All right, I've got a bunch of the stuff that's gonna get covered up, welded, as well as things that are gonna be hard to get to as I add tubes. Went ahead and welded a lot of this stuff, once again, just because getting to that, once like this X-brace and a bunch of other stuff is in there, is going to be really hard with everything in the way. I positioned these hose clamps to index this cross member here right on center with where the shocks are going to mount, and this is a pair of the shock mounting tabs. These are from Tim McCamus. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and notch the inners right here, just to fit right over that cross member when I put these up under the tube here. Since that tube's the same diameter as that tube that it sits on, it's going to have to be notched out a little bit, but that's going to help make sure everything's straight and in line also. It'll kind of interlock and detent in the correct position. So what I'm preparing to do now is I'm going to clean up everything to install this cross member. The inside of this is all cleaned up when I went ahead and popped it in. And all that, but I want to slide it out of the way, clean that up, drill my gas expansion holes, and then tack it in place. I'm going to weld over the top, just as these are welded, so that then I can put the gussets for the shock area, shock mount area on either side. Then I'm going to weld those in place partially, and work on getting the rear upper frame rails in. And then I need to notch those diagonals I've already made to fit around this tube. All right, sweet. I've started welding these gussets in, and I've got the tops of them all welded in so that I can go ahead and lay the rear upper frame rails in over them and weld those in. I've got a few beads down here as well. Just didn't want to get anything too hot. It's cross measuring squarely, and it's looking pretty good. So, all right, I got my 2 pieces of 1.5" 065 chromoly cut out, and I'm getting ready to make the rear upper frame rails. This is what they're going to look like. 45-degree curve, and going to notch them to fit that rear hoop and the rear cross member. So they'll go from there to there, and I'll also notch them for these shock area reinforcement gussets, as well as the main rear frame rails. All right, got the rear upper frame rails fitted up, notched in, and getting close to being able to weld them up, so look pretty cool. I need to weld the joints under either end back here. Just complete that weld that's going to be inside of that. All right, I've got the rear upper frame rails all cleaned out. I welded the joints under where they're going to sit, and drilled the gas expansion holes for when I weld them on. Same up top. So everything's ready to go. Just going to do a final acetone wipe down and position them and tack them in there. All right, I got the rear upper frame rails tacked in, and ended up running some beads in some spots just to get a little heat in them to kind of lean them straight. They're really difficult to line up, so I run a bead there. But just because the slightest little lean, obviously made them out of level, but got them looking pretty sweet. And before I go any further, I want to go ahead and make those truss pieces, and then I can work on welding it the rest of the way in. All right, I've got all 6 diagonal truss pieces for the rear back half section cut out. They're going to go between the upper and lower rear frame rails, and these are 2 different size tubes. The bottom's 1 5/8 and the tops are 1 1/2. And so I've gone ahead and notched these all at 1 5/8. Just knocked them out all at once, and now I'm going to mark them and go ahead and cut the 1 1/2 size side. This tubing is 1 1/4, which is what's typically used for like the X's and stuff like that, and the rest of the chassis. I'm putting an X here and another one here, and all that stuff's going to be 1 1/4, so it's just kind of the size that's appropriate for cross braces. But I'm going to set this up with a 1.5" hole saw, and Obviously this thing's set up at the proper angle. I made those parallel, so all I have to do is change the notch size and just cut them. This is 45 degrees, so just measure them out. I already calculated the length they need to be, and I'm going to change this out and go ahead and notch. All right, I've got all the truss diagonals cleaned up inside and out, wiped down, polished, and I've made not only gas expansion holes but marks where the joint between the rear and middle tubes are going to go on both sides. I've also got holes drilled in the top. Might be kind of hard to see, but I've made holes for both ends of all 6 tubes. What I ended up doing is going to a 35 degree front diagonal, which mimics this shock area gusset, and also distributed the load of the truss a little better. It also allowed me to move all the pieces to where they're kind of touching up against each other on the outside of each joint. I also did a little bit of geometry to figure out where the ideal intersection would be. If I simplified the whole truss just to lines going down the center of each tube, the diagonals would actually overlap just a little bit, which would be ideal on paper, but I think what I want to do is just butt them up against each other, and it would only be just a very small distance. So it's still really close to ideal by structural design, and it should be excellent for real application here. What I really want to focus on is just getting everything set up nicely and welded in well, so everything's cleaned inside and out. And I'm going to start with the rears, just position the front against that line, tack them in, and just kind of walk all the way to the front. Alright, make sure everything's clean and ready to go. Tack these guys in. good practice to use that post flow. Alright, cool. Here's our front. I wanted to make sure both the bottom and the top were fully seated and tacked, just to make sure that this front piece lands right where it needs to, with the upper inner tips touching here. And I needed this middle piece to be set true to have that accurate reference. Alright, cool. So I got the these diagonal pieces tacked in, and then I went ahead and tacked them on the inside as well, just to keep everything true as I move forward. You can see I centered that V with my mark there, which is my reference. It's 16 inches from the center line of this rear cross member, which I liked structurally and visually, so that looks pretty cool. And I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side, make sure everything's nice and clean. I've got my mark made, as well as all the gas holes and everything, so I'm gonna set up and zap this side together. These are just fusion tacks, just using the metal, the base metal, to make the tacks instead of adding filler rod. They're not quite as strong. They're still pretty strong, but it's just easier to do when one hand's holding the piece and play. Just make sure everything's nice and clean. Just clean these tubes all up. Wipe the insides out. Make sure the outside's wiped down. Grease free. Just like the other side, just kind of rear to front. I've used tape here to mark the 1 5/8 radius, since this is diameter rather. Since this is a 1.5 inch tube and this is 1 5/8, the notches are just a little bit different. tops of these tacked on. Then it's on to the front piece. I like to run the post flow of the argon at least until the weld and the tungsten electrode both are not glowing red. Sometimes the machine gives you a little more post flow than you really need, but for a given amperage, you know, if I was running a full bead, it gives me like a 10 or 12 second post flow, which would be a good idea to run upon completion of that bead. For tacks, it's not quite as important. All right, let's move on to the front piece here. And again, I've marked it for the big radius that goes on the bottom tube. All right, cool. They're all in place. Let's go ahead and I'm going to tack the inside now. When you're tacking, that post flow can act as a really nice pre-flow for your next tack too. But check it out, we're all tacked in, and at this point, you know, if I really need to, I can still break these tacks. Sometimes what I can do is just use a hacksaw and kind of score the tack, and then use a rubber-ended hammer or mallet to break the tube loose. But what I'm going to do is measure, make sure everything's right. If I need to pop one loose at this point, I still can, but otherwise might just throw some more tacks on here using filler rod just for a more robust tack, and then move on to putting X's in up here. I've got the one in this plane, and then I need to still cut and fit and weld in one in this plane here. So it's going to start to get really strong, and I'll show you all what it looks like as I go. All right, so next step is going to be to build an X in this area so that when the anti-roll bar is kind of acting against the chassis while being linked to the axle, this area won't won't twist and move around. It'll be tied in to both this hoop and the down bars that are going to be going between the hoop and the main hoop up there. I've got it all drawn out, angles and lengths and all that stuff, so just need to cut out 3 pieces of tubing, notch them, and fit everything up, and we'll check the process out as I go. Alright, I've got the diagonal of this X all cut out and fit it up. I'm going to go ahead and drill the vent holes. I went ahead and notched it a little bit for this weld just to make sure there's room for the tube to sit down nicely. But I'm going to go ahead and poke gas expansion holes and clean everything up and go ahead and tack this X center in. Everything's all cleaned up. Got my vent holes drilled. And right now I'm just going to stick that main diagonal in for the X, and then I'm gonna fit up the little pieces that make that into a complete X. All right, I made the upper part of the X and fit it all up. That line, the inside of that line just marks the center of the rectangle that the X is in, so I know that that top triangle is isosceles, meaning that these two sides are the same. So I'm going to go ahead and tack this in and then make a copy of it to put down here. Alright, looking good. Just one more piece to go. Alright, got the final piece of the X notched and cleaned up and ready to stick in there and tack together. Just gonna make sure it's lined up nicely and seated in, and go ahead and tack it. Alright, cool. X is in. Alright, cool. I got the X in, and it's looking good. I made sure that the 2 pieces here were in line and went ahead and tacked them in, and looking pretty good. Alright, I've just been working on welding in some of this stuff that might kind of be hard to get to once I put an X kind of right where I am. But that's what I'm going to be working on next, is go ahead and I've got the little gusset pieces of the X that go in here, and then they kind of cross this rectangle that I'm kind of residing in right now while I weld some of this stuff up. I will be able to get at all this stuff from this kind of opening here and here on either side, but I just wanted to kind of take the opportunity to burn this in a little bit, and letting it cool right now. Might you know, stick some more beads in here, but I think thinking I'm getting to where I'm ready to stick that X in and get everything all tacked up and tied together. Alright, I've got my gas expansion holes drilled and deburred for the first rearward parts of the X. Went ahead and welded this stuff up just because I won't be able to get to it quite as well once these pieces are in. And I sanded everything, and it's all wiped down with acetone. So I think next I'm just going to drop them in and tack them up, and we'll check out how that looks. All right, cool. I've got the first parts of the X all welded in. What I did is I used these pieces of tape to just make sure they go right in the exact place they need to go, and just clean everything up and went ahead and tacked it on there. All right, I've got the landing spots for this diagonal all cleaned up and my vent holes drilled, and I think it's about time I go ahead and tack it in, start forming this X back here. It's gonna look good. It's nice and tight, and zap it in. All right, let's get this diagonal in here. All right, looking good. That's step one, and next we'll fit the other two pieces in to make this an X. All right, let's stick this piece in here. I've got a piece of tape set up, just to make sure it's lined up right where I need it, and ready to tack. Alrighty. Pull it back just a touch. Just do one tack at a time. That way you can take it loose really easily if you need to. In which case I wasn't quite happy with where that was, so just moving it just a little bit. That looks great. I'm going to climb in there and give it another tack. It's a lot of work climbing in and out of this thing, but it's all going to be worth it. Peel that off just so I don't get that caught in there or burn that. All right, looking good. I'm going to check this out, make sure it's exactly where I want it, and then on to that last piece. All right, let's get this last piece tacked in. Complete this X. Let's get it lined up. All right, cool. That looks nice and straight, lines up, and good to have that X in. Nice. Put a couple more tacks on that X, and it's in. X's are in, looking good. So these parts of the X here and here kind of serve a double duty. They kill two birds with one stone. I wanted to gusset for those diagonals that keep the rear back half from flopping around, that tie into that number 1 bar there. And they both serve to gusset that area and make up this X. So I've got triangles, which are strong, and nice gussets, which are strong. So it's a win-win. Looks pretty cool. And this back half is looking like serious business. Well, all these trusses and X's turned out great, and I hope y'all enjoyed the episode. Join me next time when I accessorize the back half with these shock brackets from Tim McCamus and these suspension brackets from Tin Soldiers Racecars. Thanks for watching. I would be honored if you'd like and subscribe. See y'all again soon.